From your perspective, how did this brutal war change President Zelensky and Russian dictator Vladimir Putin and both governments, both nations?
Yeah. I mean, this is an outsider's perspective, you know? The day that you can get Vladimir Putin into your studio, you can ask him how he thinks he has changed. Hopefully it will be as someone who is out of power and having been defeated. As an outsider looking at Putin, you see he's dug further into his trench. And I don't mean a literal trench, just don't get any conspiracy theories, but he's dug into his mental and his emotional trench. You know, there was a time, and it may be hard for people to believe it. I know it might be hard for Ukrainians to believe this. There was a time near the start of his rule of Russia 25 years ago when Putin was wanting to negotiate, when Putin was wanting to maneuver in a way that wasn't necessarily a win-lose arrangement. And we can talk about that and when that stopped being the case. But at some point, Vladimir Putin, as he became an old man, he said, what am I going to leave Russia? What's going to put me up there on the pedestal with those who have been in Russia? And you know those history lessons we talked about earlier that the Russians give. He'll give those history lessons. So what is it that puts him on a pedestal with Ivan or with Peter or with Catherine? What puts him at a pedestal with the communist leaders, with a Stalin, for example? And it is a greater Russia. That was what it was going to be. That having seen the Soviet Union dissolve when he was in the KGB, having seen the turmoil that was in Russia in the 1990s, he was going to make Russia again, not only great in terms of rebuilding the economy or being part of the international community, it was going to be great in terms of an empire. And Ukraine was to be part of the empire. And when he doesn't succeed, does he give up? He can't. He can't give up. And so there's a Putin who will try to project confidence, who will try to project, I'm going to win this. But at the same time, if you watch him carefully, he doesn't know if he doesn't know if he can do it. He does not know. I've watched him so often, and I've had Russian friends work with me to watch him. He doesn't know if he can do it. And that makes him just a bit frightened. Just a bit. Not a huge amount, but just a bit frightened. And you can see it not in Putin. You can also see it in his other officials as well, including Medvedev, for all their bluster. For Russians, how's it change Russians? I don't know. I mean, I don't know. What do they think they're going to get out of this? Even if they were to, quote, win in Ukraine, what do they think they're going to get out of it for their daily lives? Because the idea of Russia being part of the international community, progressing with the international community, that's gone. That is shot. This is a country which is isolated. You know, Putin has isolated Russians in so many ways. President Zelensky, sorry, I'm going on at length, but I'll say this. And I'd appreciate your feedback, Daniel, and all our great viewers on this, but I'm struck by the fact that when it was February 2022, a man who had never been in politics before, a man who was an actor, a TV actor, a man whose first language was not Ukrainian, whose first language was Russian, a man who had been, many people questioned if he could do the job, despite that surprise victory in 2019, a man who had to deal with corruption, a man who had to deal with a lot of dysfunction of the Ukrainian government. He is a man who had to deal with blackmail by Donald Trump, cutting off aid, because Zelensky wouldn't give Trump what he wanted on Joe Biden. Zelensky had been in power for just over a year and a half. And now there's an invasion that he did not expect, or at least he had hoped it wouldn't happen. And now he and his ministers have to go out on the night of February 24th, 2022, and they have to tell Ukrainians, we don't have to give up. Just put yourself in that place. Power is cut off in Kyiv. They go out there by the light of their mobile phones. But that was not an actor when Zelensky gave that statement that night. For me, that was someone who became a president. Because at that point, it's not an act. It is all real in terms of what is happening. Now, Zelensky is not an angel. He is not a god. He has his flaws, and you and I have discussed it, and there will be issues when this invasion ends that Ukrainians will have to decide where there have been mistakes, there have been errors. But I think Zelensky became a leader. And I want to tell you this from personal love, if you don't mind me, Daniel, because I think it reflects the best of Ukraine. That 4 years later, when Zelensky speaks to Ukrainians, but when he speaks to people abroad, he still tells jokes. He still laughs. He still tries to connect with people in terms of what they've experienced. He did that when he came to Ireland last year. His wife, Elena, does the same. When they go to the memorials in Ukraine to mark the war dead, that's genuine in terms of what they're feeling. They're human beings, man. They are absolute human beings. I would love to have dinner, not with a president, but just with a man named Vladimir Zelensky. I would love to have dinner with him and his wife. See if you can get me an invite. I would not want to have dinner with Vladimir Putin. I don't think I would enjoy it that much. And of course, you asked me about Ukrainians. I would love to have dinner with Ukrainians. And I might do with you fairly soon. Because I'm going to put something to you as an outsider. And in 1991, you got your independence. And there's been a lot of issues that you all have had to deal with. You've had to deal with politicians who sometimes have let you down, quite often have let you down. You've had to deal with infighting. You've had to deal with, even when it wasn't an invasion, neighbors that raised issues about your security. You've had to deal with an uncertain status. Are you part of Europe? Are you not part of Europe? You know all those issues I can tell about. I'm going to put this to you. I think Ukraine became a nation on February 24th, 2022. And I don't want to put down that you were a nation before that. And I don't want to put down what it meant to get independence back. But I think when you face extinction as a nation, I think when you face that choice, do you surrender or do you persist? That's when nations are formed. And it's not perfect, not a perfect nation. But that's when you all are more than individuals. That's when you know what it means to be Ukrainian. I think that's my sense. I can't say that's true, but that's my sense. And that's why I tell you on this 4th anniversary, it will not be the end of this invasion. It won't be the end of the bloodshed. But what has been started because of Vladimir Putin is not what he predicted. It is not greater Russia. It is a sense of how can Ukraine be greater? And that's even bigger than President Zelensky. That's all of you.
Thank you. This really was hour and a half podcast just to discuss these topics. How did the war change Ukrainians and Putin's regime? Looking forward to a podcast with you. But let's move forward and also discuss security guarantees for Ukraine, because former British Prime Minister Boris Johnson says that UK and its allies should deploy non-combat troops to Ukraine right now, not after the war ends, to, quote, flip a switch in Russian President Putin's head. How close are we to this, and are there any chances of British ground deployment to Ukraine before the war ends?
Mr. Johnson, please stop. Please stop saying things to get headlines. You are not helping the situation here. I'm going to try to be polite. God, I was feeling so good after that question about Ukraine and what it means, to watch Ukraine be so brave. And now I talk about this. Let me take you back to spring of 2022 when Boris Johnson was prime minister. Boris Johnson came in the middle of the Istanbul talks when Russia was trying to force Ukraine's surrender at a time, a desperate time, of course, for everyone there. And Johnson lets it be known that he's told Ukraine, "Oh no, you can't accept these terms in these talks. You have to demand this, or you can't do this." He handed Russia a propaganda gift that it still uses to this day. Because what Russia says is it was Boris Johnson that prevented a settlement at the Istanbul talks. Now, I can tell you, because I've studied this in detail, that it was actually Russia refusing to agree to the terms and adding additional demands on Ukraine that prevented a settlement, as well as also the fact that we got news of what had happened in places like Bushehr, of the mass killings. But the very fact that Johnson had blundered in with that clumsy intervention meant that Russia has been able to portray itself as the victim of Ukraine and Europe for 4 years. Now, here we are 4 years later. He's not in power, but Boris Johnson still wants to be relevant. And so what does he do? He gives an interview to try to be relevant and says, "Oh, I've got this bright idea. We'll just simply put these British troops in here." Look, fundamentally, we want security guarantees for Ukraine, right? I think we can all agree that. But we also have to agree that security guarantees have to be very carefully arranged and coordinated. You don't simply throw troops in. They have to have logistical support. They have to have intelligence support. And the UK troops cannot go in on their own. There's not enough of them even to monitor the ceasefire. And therefore, you've got to talk about other European forces, and you've got to talk about how they work with Ukraine. But beyond that, we don't have a ceasefire. That's the reality. Now, maybe you put those British troops in Western Ukraine at the drone manufacturing plants and in other places, fair enough. But if you put them anywhere close to the front line, they become a justified target for the Russians. Because the Russians will say, "We told the Europeans, don't you put troops into what we still consider to be a war zone." Now, what do you do if the Russians attack those British forces? What do the British do? Do they fire back? He hasn't thought that through, because I would like to think Boris Johnson has the good of Ukrainians as his priority, but I don't think he has the good of Ukrainians as his priority. I think his priority is with himself. So it's an extremely unhelpful statement. It is not practical to do this way, and it distracts from what we need to talk about, which is there need to be carefully arranged security guarantees with multiple countries on the air, on the ground, and in other support operations, whether that's engineering, logistics, cyber operations.
Let's also cover final topic, and maybe let's get back to our previous discussion about Ukraine as nation. What can, from your perspective, after the war ends, what can face Ukrainians? What's next?
The rest of your lives. I mean, that. I'm not sure it's for me to say that. I think what I'm going to want to ask from Ukrainians is how they negotiate this, and how, in even a small way, I and other people can support them. Look, it will be a happy day when this invasion is stopped, especially if there is no more surrender of territory, especially if Ukraine gets its security. But I also know that there will be a lot of heartbreak and trauma that people still have to work through. Any celebration of the end of bloodshed doesn't erase the bloodshed that's already taken place. Any celebration of the end of heartbreak doesn't stop the heartbreak that's already taken place. People will take people take different amounts of times, but in many cases, many, many years to even get over this that takes place. I think, just speaking from my personal perspective, I would hope that those people who mark that heartbreak and always remember what has happened, that they talk about what they can look forward to. If not for themselves, then for their children, right? How do you build up a Ukraine which is safe? But also, how do you build up a Ukraine which shows us the best in what a nation can be? When I was struck last summer, when in the middle of an invasion, in the middle of all the missile and the drone strikes, that I remember you and I talked, and I hope you don't mind me saying this, but we talked off camera. We talked about people in Ukraine who came out to tell their government, we want to be better. We want you to be better, and we want to be better. We don't want the corruption. We don't want just a few people profiting. We want every Ukrainian to profit. We don't want there to be party factions and division. We want there to be party competition, but in a healthy way. Back in 1945, at the end of World War II, what was striking in the country that was long my home, the United Kingdom, which didn't suffer the greatest in World War II. It suffered a great deal, didn't it? But there was that moment in British history when Britons thought they could have a better country. You know, I could talk to you about the welfare state. I could talk to you about changes for health, for education. I could talk to you about, but it was also the notion that this wasn't the Britain of the past, that this had to be a Britain which was looking forward. Unfortunately, the Britain of 2026 that I've left no longer looks forward. It looks backward. I would like Ukraine to look forward. I would hope Ukraine can look forward to being better, and that they don't lose sight of that. And I also would hope that the first thing that Ukrainians think of for their lives is not Vladimir Putin. It's always easy to think of the villain. In fact, he's beyond a villain. You can think of the words to describe a mass murderer. I would hope that that's not the first thing Ukrainians think of. I hope the first thing they think of is themselves. We survived. And not only did we survive because we kept our dignity and we kept our values. That's what I hope happens.
Hi, I'm Scott Lucas. Thank you so much for watching. If you like what you see, subscribe, spread the word, send ideas.